right, good morning. So before I begin, I am a scholar of settler colonial theory, and I also work a lot with indigenous philosophy, so I'm going to start with land acknowledgement. So this is taken from the San Diego State University's land acknowledgement that we recently adopted at our campus, and was written by my colleague, Mike Connolly, Ms. Fisher's Kumiai. So this is the abridged version, and I encourage everyone to look up the fuller version online. So for millennia, the Kumiai people have been part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumiai. Okay. So Facebook launched when I was in high school, at the end of high school. I remember at that time not understanding exactly what it was or why it was created, but reluctantly set up an account when my friends did. I remember also the confusion within and beyond college about how something like Facebook and later other social media sites could be free. From the purview of the now, this naivete seems shocking, but it was truly genuine. Looking back, I think the shared horror at the power of data harvesting and mining sits uncomfortably next to the genuine newness, innovation, and convenience social media posed. We were happy, or at least unbothered at the time, to willfully and of our own volition share our information in what we now know was exchange for the connection and community of our digital selves. In this way, data, like anything else, has become a resource for extraction, for harvesting, and exploitation. This particular genie is out of the bottle. Years later, still using Facebook, I remember seeing the perfect visual representation of what had happened with social media and how it funded itself. I looked across the room at my partner reading the latest issue of Adbusters, and it was this one, right? On the back cover was the following image. I remember seeing the rat in the Skinner box, the various levers primed to pump the sweet, sick satisfaction of social media, validation, and feedback. Just like the poor rat in the Skinner box, we keep pushing the lever, even when we know that the reward is rarely close at hand. We return again to refresh the levers, hoping, holding our breath that something new, novel, and affirming will appear. Are we tagged? Are we liked? Are we retweeted? Are we valid? Are we relevant? Are we followed? This makes sense in the now understood scheme of users of social media as the assets for data mining and collection generally. The more we return to the levers of operant conditioning in the digital Skinner box, the more information about our desires, behaviors, fears, obsessions, and vulnerabilities can be mined and harvested for targeted advertising. Similarly, the more face time we put in, the more of those targeted ads we can see and interact with. We had willfully entered this digital Skinner box, and many of us never even noticed what we had given up, or perhaps even understood or conceptualized it as a loss. I think it is telling also that the Skinner box in the rendering here is transparent. This points not only to the intangible nature of the digital realm, but I think for me also points to the dangers of the neoliberal dogma of transparency that can be traced back to the Enlightenment and obsession with knowability and knowledge, both as domination and capture. This pathology for the transparent led to a call for the right to opacity espoused by Black Caribbean philosopher and theorist Edward Glissant. The right to opacity is precisely about the right to the opaque, to the dark, to the unknowable. The mere specter of the opaque terrifies dominant society, big tech, capitalism, and all the structures that converge on the transparency, the visibility, and the infinity of our desires. Opacity is read by the global police state as the invitation for scrutiny, invasion, and violence, precisely because the imperative of transparency and whiteness reads the dark, opaque, and God forbid the willfully opaque dark subject as elusive, as clearly hiding something, as up to no good. These subjects in some ways are professing their resistance against the game, their unwillingness to play the game, and thus importantly are thus importantly read as threats that must be targeted, dealt with, and possibly eliminated. Artist Zach Blass has taken up Glissant's work and ideas on the right to opacity and his work most concretely in his facial weaponization suite, an interactive art piece spanning from 2011 to 2014. And I encourage everyone to look this up, it's really good. As a part of this work, Blass created face masks, which he titled Fag Face, pictured here. These masks relate to the right to opacity and opacity in general in a variety of ways. Firstly, the masks obscure the face against biometrical harvesting of facial images and features to be captured for facial recognition research. The face masks literally impede the ability of facial detection software to recognize the face. These masks do not do this only by physically obscuring the face, but also by creating what Blass calls a fog, because the masks are actually the combination of many different facial features pulled from harvested data of faces. In fact, the faces were chosen strategically from a repository of images from a 2008 experiment conducted at Tufts University, which showed images of faces and measured the ability of participants to determine the sexual orientation of the faces. 90 faces were shown to 90 participants. The faces were cropped and stripped of all accessories, adornments, even hair. The study found that participants were highly successful at picking out and classifying faces identified as gay, even when the faces were only shown for 50 milliseconds, and even when just an isolated feature of the face was shown, such as lips or eyes. A similar study was conducted at the University of Washington in 2012 with similar results. Blass importantly asks in his communique for the facial weaponization suite, what could be the benefits of proving to the world that such a recognition apparatus exists? Does it not only further confirm and scientifically validate one of the processes of LGBTQI stereotyping categories like fag face and gay face? It is easy enough to claim that these studies parse us into categories that will inevitably be used against us. It offers a visibility that will attempt to control, monitor, and police us. In response to this, Blass created the fag face masks as a mode of resistance against this weaponization. He uses this combination of features to create what he calls, I think I should not have gone there, to create what he calls a fog of queerness that refuses to be identified. Using and turning the logics and scientific studies against the possibility for weaponization, queerness emerges as a site of creation and resistance to the transparency and visibility the harvesting of faces aims to both solidify, expand, and weaponize. Blass also contrasts what he calls the queer politics of escape against more normative practices of queer politics that situate progress in increased neoliberal campaigns and activism for LGBTQI communities to be both incorporated into and identified or recognized by the state. For example, campaigns for same-sex marriage. For Blass, these forms of resistance, refusal, and escape from the biometrical and biopolitical power of the state constitute a queer politics of escape and a possibility for living otherwise, grounded in both opacity and the right to opacity. If we return to the transparent digital apparatus of the Skinner box as digital platforms and social media that harvest our data, which includes our faces, we can see a kind of perverse intimacy performed through highly impersonal, legalistic, and contractual dominant understandings of consent. However, this is a limited and shallow notion of consent, as the legality and box-checking understanding of consent is really the bare minimum of a dominant Euro-Western white political tradition. Here we can see some of our most personal, intimate details of ourselves are made the bread and butter of the culture industry, repackaging and reflecting our deepest insecurities, fears, and desires back to us with a product for that. There's an app for that, a cream for that, a temporary soul-filling fix for that, if you can only identify with the products your details and posts reveal about you and pay for. So the price of social media is actually quite high. So what does it mean to be an asset among strangers who know your deepest insecurities, fears, and desires, but don't actually know who you are? Well, the Euro-Western philosophical tradition has told us that knowing ourselves or working out the complicated intricacies of the self is perhaps one of the most important tasks that those who would introspect and philosophize can do. Debates about what, how, and who the self is and how the self is constituted raged through every period of Euro-Western philosophy up until the present. Within this tradition, the self has been identified as private, as a privileged kind of interiority, as something the subject gradually comes to know through introspection and reflective existence, as something known and revealed through sharing that results from the choices of the subject. Indeed, Euro-Western political theory has had a huge hand in developing the liberalistic and now neoliberal understandings of the self and subject as the most essential unit and expression of individuality, of reason, of progress, to the detriment and under-theorization of all the ways that the self and subject is actually entirely dependent on others, communities, and the labor of those constituted as others, as inessential. So we have a contradiction, right, which philosophers hate. The highest order of Euro-Western enlightenment dictates that the self, the individual, is sacred, while at the same time, the liberal, neoliberal political order, deeply wedded to capitalism, says that our deepest fears, insecurities, and desires are the raw material for powering the culture industry and can be mined, extracted, and harvested at will, with the more basic and superficial forms of contract and consent. You want to access the networking community and resources of social media? Here's where I wanted to do it. Well, in the words of Ursula, it won't cost much, just your voice. Unfortunately, the transparency and therefore intentional and constructed invisibility of the Skinner box digital apparatus has also contributed to the normalization and naturalization of data mining through sharing, searches, and tracking user and consumer interests and behaviors. This has become another quotidian feature of our current existence, but the stakes and consequences of these everyday practices is quite high and pernicious. The relatively intangible quality and interestingly opaque but also apparent nature of this data collection means that clear forms of resistance are also muddied. As Blase's work demonstrates, things as obvious and accessible as our faces are being used against us. Adorno and Horkheimer, in their chapter on the culture industry or enlightenment as mass deception, wrote about the entanglement of beings with systems such as consumer capitalism, pop culture, entertainment industries, advertising, and so on. They state, but the necessity inherent in the system of never releasing its grip on the consumer, of not for a moment allowing him or her to suspect that resistance is possible. The peculiar position of being the asset as consumer, the resource to be extracted from, is that the self leaches into and becomes in some ways indistinguishable from both consumption and the choices and desires that are curated for consumption. In this way, it is difficult to tell where our interiority, manifested in our searches, clicks, eye movement tracking, facial scans, and so on, ends, and our transparent Skinner box begins. Are we as assets then some cyborg assemblage or configuration of the data harvested from us? Is our data us? Does it present a holistic picture or assemblage of our being? Does it tell us enough so concretely that strangers can know or predict our behaviors, our political affiliations, what we dream about, what our nightmares are? Are these shadows that mine, scrub, clean, and compile our data our friends, our enemies? Are they just doing their jobs? Are we just doing ours? These questions, I think, are important, and I also think the answers or solutions are unclear. However, an important pathway forward this presentation perhaps gestures to is the debunking the idea that resistance is impossible or futile. As we know, the dangers of data mining and biometrical, biopolitical surveillance and control is that the structural inequalities and oppressive apparatuses of society will only be reinforced and permeated through more ineffable and difficult to track digital apparatus such as the transparent Skinner box. We need to remember and sit with the possibility that we still know ourselves more than any algorithm, data analyst, or company that trades our data for the use of their service. If there is power in queerness and power in the fog, it is because we have the ability, and I think desire, to use the same things that are harvested from us to our advantage, to confuse, override, and generally flummox the system. As LePaperson says, right, who's also Wayne Yang at UCSD, the beauty of decolonial desires in a colonial apparatus is that the machines we make are bound to break and be reassembled, break down and be reassembled always. From the scraps, cyborgs will create and make new machines that do things coloniality and dominant society never dreamed of or imagined. The possibility in that disassembly and creation poses perhaps a repository and a well of resilience and resistance that gives me hope. Thank you.